We are about to start the session of Indian literature by Manasi Subramaniam, Renuka Chatterjee and S.P. Dala. I invite the audience to be on the seats. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Just to briefly introduce us, the author in our midst, the writer in our midst is Priya Dala. She is a writer from South Africa, and she's written 2 novels. The first one, What About Mira? And the second, which we have just published, which has just come out in India, though it has been out in the US and in South Africa for some time, is The Architecture of Loss. Talking to her are 2 of our 2 editors, my publishing colleague Manasi Subramaniam, who earlier was with HarperCollins, now with Penguin, and I'm Renuka Chatterjee, now with Speaking Tiger Publishers in Delhi, but I started my career with Penguin way back in '92 and was also briefly with HarperCollins. So here you are, Zainab, flanked by 2 editors. And since you're from South Africa, it would be really interesting to get a perspective on what it is like for a writer to be published and edited in South Africa. How different is it from the Indian experience? So to start by asking you, when you wrote your first novel, What About Mira? How easy or how difficult was it for you to find a publisher?
Thank you, Renuka ji. In South Africa, we don't need a literary agent to approach our publishers. So, I was very lucky in that my debut novel I sent directly to Penguin, South Africa. It's Penguin Random House, South Africa, and I didn't need an agent. So it was. I think within 4 months, I received a positive response, and they decided to take the novel. When I went to publish The Architecture of Loss, which was published in the US, I had to go through a literary agent. So the difficulty I think I found was more in the US publication than in actually publishing in South Africa.
Yes, well, that's a bit similar to what happens in India. Unlike in Britain, in the UK and in the US, where most publishers don't accept direct submissions from authors, and an author has to first find an agent before he or she can hope to find a publisher. In India, since we have really just very few professional agents, most publishers do accept direct submissions from authors also. But Manasi, I'd like to ask you, when you get, if you get a submission through an agent, or if it's an indirect, if it's a direct submission from the author, and I'm talking about a first-time unknown author, what would your inclination be to first look at the agent submission where you feel at least there is a professional eye that has vetted it, or would you be equally interested in looking at an unknown author who's just sent you their manuscript out of the blue?
I have to admit that I'd look at the agented submission first, primarily because unsolicited manuscripts are so vast in number, whereas agented submissions are much fewer, and the significant advantage is not just the vetting actually. For me, it is that the agent knows what I like, and therefore if it's something that's suited to my taste, it would come to me, but if it's suited to another editor's taste, it would go to another editor. With unsolicited manuscripts, it's luck of the draw. You never know whose hands that manuscript might find its way to.
True, the slush pile is something which I don't think any of us ever catch up with. The slush pile being the unsolicited manuscripts that just come in to us, land up in your inbox if the author is smart enough to get your direct email, or land up in your editorial submissions folder. And as Manasi says, we really there's no way of knowing how good or bad they are. We do try and look at all of them at some stage, because again, you just never know when some real gem may turn up in the slush pile, and publishing history is littered with stories of how a manuscript was lying around in somebody's inbox or in the slush pile, and one day some editor read it and it turned out to be absolutely brilliant. But it takes a long time to get through it all, and I'm not sure if this is a true story, but I was told at one point that the longest time an editor ever sat over an unsolicited manuscript was 27 years. But it's true that if a submission comes to you from an agent, and especially if it's an agent who is established and who has a record of taking on good work, then you are reasonably sure that at least it's something which you can spend a little time reading and looking at, and that, as Manasi says, if the agent has sent it to me and not to another editor in my organization, not to another publisher, then it's probably because the agent knows that it's the sort of work that I like. But having said that, I will say that a lot of agents do just make random submissions, and they do tend to bombard you with submissions. So it's becoming almost, the agent submissions are now becoming almost like the slush pile, where it's very difficult to catch up with them all.
Can I add one thing?
Sure.
The thing that I find the thing that I'm probably the most reluctant to get to is when people reach out to me directly, but via social media. So I do get submissions on Facebook and Twitter and LinkedIn and whatnot, and that I find that I'm genuinely reluctant to get to, because these are personal profiles, and I just find that it's unprofessional to submit through a Facebook message.
Well, fortunately for me, I'm not on social media, not on Facebook, Twitter, or anything. So the only way anyone can reach me is through my email. But Priya, to get back to you, you said that for your first book, you didn't need an agent. You got published directly. But this is What About Meera? And could you first tell us a little bit about the story of What About Meera?
I think,
because, sorry to interrupt, but by its very name, it seems to have quite a lot of Indian context. And to just give you all a little background, yes, Zainab Priya Dala does have a strong Indian connection. One of her parents is from the UP, the other is from Lahore. And as you could tell from her name, it is an interfaith family. But she is a third generation Indian South African. As she told us yesterday, Indians in South Africa still call themselves Indian South Africans and not South African Indians. So the Indian connection is very strong with them. But do tell us a little bit about the story of What About Meera?
I think, to add to this conversation about submitting and sending in to publishers, and that'll lead into your question. I find that your synopsis, if you send a very good synopsis in first, possibly 3 chapters, they don't have to be the chronological chapters. So you're not sending your entire manuscript to a publisher, and you're not bombarding them with this big huge manuscript. If you have a well-written synopsis that you took a lot of time in thinking out what you want to say about your book, almost cutting it down to 1 page, publishers are a little bit more open to reading, at least taking it 1 step further, because you have to understand they are being bombarded on a daily basis. So in synopsis, What About Meera is the story of an Indian South African woman who is trying to find an identity as to whether she is Indian or whether she is South African, because, and the story is set during the time where apartheid in South Africa is very strong. So Meera, who is the protagonist of the novel, has to sort of navigate her way between Western cultural ideals and her Indian identity and the strong family system that comes from a family that's second generation from India. So the novel follows Meera through her life, and the difficulties that an Indian South African woman faces, like, for example, the stigmatization of divorce, and how she is almost cast out of her community because of divorce. She then decides to make her life in a Western country, and that's in Dublin, in Ireland, thinking that maybe here she will be more accepted. But in the story, and I don't want to give away too much, she finds that acceptance is not something you can seek in a culture. It's something that you've got to seek within yourself. So if I were to put that as a synopsis, that would be my synopsis that I'd send to an editor or to a publisher.
Although as an editor, I like it when the synopsis does give away the ending. For me, because all I get is 3 chapters, and I don't necessarily have the time to read an entire manuscript, but I do want to know how it ends.
Yes, that's true. When I get a very brief synopsis, I often ask the author to give me a more detailed one, because even though eventually the blurb that you carry in the book shouldn't give away the ending, but at this stage, you do need to know how the story develops, what's the progression of the novel.
Absolutely. And for me, the blurb is nothing like the synopsis, because the blurb has adjectives, and I think synopses should lack adjectives entirely. I just want a straightforward plot.
I think when, to add to that, when I was writing this, I didn't want to give away the ending of the book, so people will want to buy the book. I think when I was writing my synopsis, I had a lot of help from the writing college that I was attended, and one of the strong things that they came across was you almost have to be objective in writing your own synopsis of your own work, and you need to add in there, why is this novel relevant? Why is it important for this publisher to take it at this particular time? What social message are you trying to put out there? As in, even if it's a science fiction novel, you've got to explain why this novel should be taken on by a publisher, and why is it relevant to the time.
Renuka, do you often get manuscripts with marketing pitches included?
All the time. And I must say, those are the ones that I found that I am more inclined, probably rather unfairly, but to just turn down or not really look at them seriously, because I just feel that if an author starts off by making such a strong pitch and planning out exactly how they're going to market their book, or what they expect the publisher to do to market the book, and what sort of, they've already outlined what sort of readership and so on, then there's probably something lacking in the book itself, in the writing. Now this is a purely subjective judgment, and I have read manuscripts which have a marketing plan and a marketing pitch, which do actually turn out to be quite good, but I would really advise authors, at least at this stage, let your work speak for itself. First convince the publisher about the quality of your work, and then you can sit down and thrash out a marketing plan. And as far as the readership goes, yes, certainly it's good to have a broad idea of what kind of reader you're targeting the book at. It also helps the publisher to know whether that is the kind of readership they can really reach out to, because every publisher has got different strengths and different focuses. But I think one should leave it at that. What do you feel?
In your time in publishing, have you ever found a masterpiece in the slush pile?
I can't think of any. Though I have, let's say, of the out of 100 unsolicited manuscripts, every 100 unsolicited manuscripts, maybe I have ended up publishing 2 or 3, maximum 5, but that's about it. I do have to go on and say that there are a couple of manuscripts which came to me unsolicited, and because they were unsolicited and they were first novels, so the authors were not really in a position to put too much pressure or to say that they had sent it to other publishers and so on. I sat on them for a very long time, not 27 years, but for one I did sit on for about 2 years, and then they did end up getting published and went on to be very successful. One of them was Neil Mukherjee's first novel, which came to me called Still Crossing, but I think it was published as something else. And after it had been with me for almost 2 years, when I finally got round to reading it, I did drop him a mail and say, look, since it's been so long, is this manuscript still available? And he said, oh, unfortunately, I've just sold the rights to Picador in the UK. And Neil Mukherjee has now gone on to become one of our leading writers. He's been on a Booker shortlist and so on. So that was one I really kicked myself about. And the other was Advaita Kala's Almost Single, which again came to me unsolicitedly, and which is completely unknown. And it was then titled Love in Stilettos. And since it was an unsolicited manuscript, I just gave it to one of our readers to read because I thought, let me first get an initial evaluation, and then if it's worth reading, then I'll look at it. And the person who read it gave it such a bad report that I said, oh, it's not worth wasting my time, and I didn't take it. And HarperCollins published it and went on to sell some 30,000 copies, and it's been sold in the US. So yes, these are some of the publishing mistakes that we make. But to get back to you, Priya, what about Mira wasn't agented initially, so it's not really been published outside of South Africa. But now for the Architecture of Loss, you do have an agent, a very good agent, Maria at Pontus Agency. And so it's been published by Pegasus in the US. It came to us in India, and now because we're publishing that, we've got interested in publishing What About Mira. So how would you differentiate between the agented and the unagented experience?
I think for me, one of the best things I ever did was got myself an agent, because it's very different from what you're saying. My experience is very different from what you're saying, because when my novel was pitched to the US market via an agent, at first I was unagented. One of the things the US publishers were telling me was to actually put it forward as a marketing pitch. Why is this relevant? Why do we need to publish this? And that was in the US market. So I was very confused because I didn't have the same experience with South Africa. So I think the only way I could get beyond that was they were rejecting it. The Architecture of Loss, I was rejected, I think, about 5 times, even in South Africa. And one of the reasons was they felt I'm not marketing myself strongly. So then I decided that I needed an agent, and my agent can do that work for me. So I'm not coming to a publisher as just an author from nowhere. And I must say, one of the strong things that assisted was biography, where they look at your body of work. So nobody really is objective. They look strongly at where you're coming from. They look at what you've already put out, even if it's newspaper articles or short story competitions that you've won. So having said that, my agent, which is Maria at Pontus, was someone who was very actively involved in the publishing, in actually during the editing process, during the rough draft. So I think both experiences, What About Mira was very different from my experience with Architecture of Loss. And I must say the experience with an agent was probably a better experience, yeah.
What about the actual editorial process? Was it different in India, South Africa, the US?
Yes, it was very different where, because I was talking about things that were, say, for example, for me, particularly South African, like a cultural phenomenon or a terminology that was South African terminology. I found myself in the US having to always explain myself all the time. It was a question of always having to advocate. I felt like I'm advocating for this novel. So I didn't have to do that with the South African readership or the South African publisher, but with the South African publisher, I had to constantly be explaining the Indian connection because they didn't get that. They got the Western things, they got the African things, but they didn't get the Indian things. So in this entire thing, I've just been navigating myself through a minefield, actually.
So are there 3 different editions then?
Which book are you talking about?
The book that's been published in all three
Yes,
territories.
it's 3 different editions. There's the US edition that came out in July of last year. And then we have a French edition, a French translation actually. And then now Speaking Tigers taking on Subcontinent edition. Yeah.
Again, talking about the editing process, as we were discussing it briefly earlier this morning, you said that you actually welcomed your agent's editing, and you were quite open to a lot of the suggestions and to changing parts of the book. But then there is a point where you stick to your guns and say, no, this is the way I want it to be. How easy or how difficult a process do you find that, whether you're working with an agent or with an editor?
The experience working with my agent was very different from working with my editor, because I knew my agent very personally, so I didn't find that I have to keep explaining. When it came to editing, the editor always tried to push me to remove parts of the novel that, in their personal opinion, they felt were possibly difficult or possibly controversial. So I think that's where I drew the line. When it came to craft and construction, I listened very much to my editor. But when it came to the story and the message and the narrative, I didn't budge on that one. I must say I listened to the editor because I'm a writer. I don't write chronologically. I write very stream of consciousness. So the agent helped me to actually tame myself down. But when it came to content, I actually became a bit of a pain to my agent because I was sticking to my guns when it came to controversial content especially. They told me to take it out, I refused to take it out.
Manasi, let me ask you, as an editor, how interactive is your process with an author? Do you, for instance, rewrite, make a lot of structural changes, or do you, if you feel it's necessary, of course, or do you in the end feel that it is important to respect the fact that this is not your work in the end, it is somebody else's work? You have to respect their voice and their views. How do you get around this problem? Because I know this is a problem we face all the time. How much to rewrite and how much to let go?
I am a very, very hands-on editor. I'm involved from the beginning until the end and after publication as well. And I've noticed that I have this habit of sometimes slipping into saying things like our book when I'm talking to the author, because I take such great ownership over the work. Yes. I think in most cases this has worked for me, because when I don't do actual rewrites, but I do very, very extensive edits and very, very extensive feedback, and I leave the rewriting to the authors. And because I work with literary authors, that process is much easier, because they are attuned to feedback and they're interested in rewriting, and they get nuance very easily. And of course, I've had raging disagreements with authors, but that's part of the process as well, and that's part of the way in which I figure out what the vision for the book is, because the more I speak to the author and the more I work very closely on line editing and structural editing and the overall arc of the book, the more I do that, the more involved I get in how the book needs to be envisioned in the long run. And that helps me when I'm later working with, the social media department or the marketing department or the sales department about things like, where should we display this book, and what is the target readership. At that point, I really want to get involved in marketing and readership and positioning and that sort of thing.
Well, of course, there are some manuscripts which are easy to rewrite if it's a question of just the language, which may be faulty or ungrammatical. And I think most writers, if you rewrite in that sense, they're quite okay with it, because they can see that you have made it read better. But it's the structural changes and the changes in content that, as you say, sometimes one can have a lot of disagreements before you finally reach a stage where you are both in agreement. But I think what is important is what you said, is to treat it as our book, because I think most editors, by the time you're through from reading the first draft to finally seeing it off to press, it's as much your book as the author's book. And I think most authors do in the end appreciate that. But again, Priya, from an author's point of view, to what extent are you willing to let go of the complete ownership of your work and accept that once there is a publisher and it is a work which is going to go out there in the world and be read by a lot of people, that you need to let someone else come onto the stage and be part of the process with you?
I think I've evolved because when I first started out, I wanted to be in complete control all the time. And, you feel this is my work, this is my book. And even right down to cover design, I wanted to be fully autonomous. I actually delayed publication of What About Mira in South Africa because of a color on the cover, one particular color. And I think I've evolved, I've learned. And now I'd love to be involved. I always say to my publishers, I want to be involved in the marketing of the book. If whatever I can do, if they can set out a plan for me to follow, then I will know exactly the vision that they want me to take this forward. But at some point, once the book is out there, when your publisher puts it out there, you have to just let go of control because the book is not yours any longer. It actually belongs to the reader, not the editor, not the publisher. It belongs to the reader. And during What About Mira, I couldn't really handle that because if I had feedback from readers, I had found myself explaining myself to readers, and now that's changed because now it's years down the line, and I realized that the eventual outcome is something you cannot control. You can control everything right down to the publication and where the book gets placed in a bookshop, but what happens to it afterwards is not in your control.
I once heard an editor say that the author-editor relationship is like a marriage, and for like those 6 to 8 months, you're practically married to each other. And I think that's totally true. I've had some experiences where, I've been woken up at 3 in the morning by panicked phone calls from writers with writer's block saying, I don't know what to do with this scene, you have to talk to me right now. And that's part of the magic of creation, I think.
Very much so. I mean, I've never done a 3 o'clock in the morning call, but I've sent my editor very, very panicking emails, and I've had fights with my editor because she was not understanding what I'm trying to say. But I found that once we got to dialogue more and we got to know, as we developed a relationship, it's like a marriage, as you say. There's the first phase and then there's the honeymoon phase. So as I got to know her as a person and as she got to know me, then it flowed more smoothly, the entire process, yeah.
And I think one of the big problems in this marriage is often the cover, because the cover is obviously very important to the author because that is the look of their book, but it's also equally important to the publisher because the cover is how we market the book. It's the look of the book also helps us to market it. And very often the kind of cover that the author wants from the publisher's point of view is just not marketable. It's just not going to make an impact out there on the shelves. So this is a battle which I think we're constantly fighting. Would you agree, Manasi?
I completely agree. And I think what happens very often for me is there is one transition point always where at which the author comes to the realization that actually the publishing house is not the enemy and we're in this together. Yeah. And if they're saying something, it's because it has some merit and they have some experience with the market and positioning and the way it looks on e-commerce, for example. That's not something authors ever think about. How will this book look on Amazon? But that is, we are sort of attuned to thinking about. And so I think very often that transition point where we realize that actually we're in this together and we have to find a way to make sure that your vision of the book is not compromised, nor is the way I want the book to be perceived by the readership that I have in mind for it.
Well, I think publishers That's one reason why publishers try and safeguard themselves by putting in these couple of lines of the contract saying that as far as the cover goes, that the author's views will be taken into account, but the final decision is the publisher's. But, when it gets to that point where you have to throw the contract at the author and say, listen, I'm the one who has the last word, it is usually a crisis situation. And we do try and avoid getting to that stage.
Yeah, I know. As a policy, I try to avoid bringing the contract into conversations with authors. And that's one of the reasons I love having agents in the middle, because you do the dirty business with the agents. You talk money and negotiations and contracts with the agent, and then it's just pure love with the author. Otherwise, it's like having a prenuptial agreement in your marriage.
Well, I'd say it's pure love, and it's a honeymoon period, usually throughout the editing process. But where we run into problems is when it comes to marketing and promotion, where again, sometimes quite rightly, sometimes wrongly, the author usually expects a lot more to be done for the book than it is possible sometimes for an author to do financially, as in terms of having big launch events or multi-city tours and all that. Every book has to basically pay for itself. So if it is an established author who already has a readership of some at least 40, 50,000 readers in the country, and you know that the book is going to sell that much, then you can have that kind of budget. But if it's a first-time author, not so well-known author, then how can we put in that kind of money without knowing whether we're going to earn it back? But the other problem is the book not being available in bookshops. I don't know if you face this in South Africa, but at least here we get complaints all the time from authors that I've just been to Kochi and I didn't find my book anywhere in the bookstores, or I'm just flying back from Bangalore and it was not there at the airport. Manasi, do you also experience this?
Absolutely, on an everyday basis. This happens all the time, and the authors are absolutely right. If it's within 6 months of publication, they have every right to call me and say, why is it not in this bookstore or that city? But shelf space is shrinking.
Yes.
I don't see a solution to this problem. This is why I'm glad that e-commerce is in the picture, because you can never say it's not available on this website or that website.
Yes. That does make a lot of difference. And also, I feel a certain kind of helplessness when I get these complaints from an author that their book is not available in such and such place or bookshop. Sometimes in the same city, it is available in 1 or 2 bookstores, but it's not available in the bookstore that the author happens to walk into. And I do feel rather helpless, because when you're on the editing side or the publishing side, all you can really do is to send a strong mail to your salesperson or your marketing person, say, why isn't this book available? But you can't physically go there and make the book available. So that's one of the battles in which I am on the side of the author, but it's an ongoing battle and we have to keep trying to remedy it. But to get back to something which you mentioned, Priya, you mentioned going to writing college. Did you find that it helped you to actually go and study the craft of writing?
I just want your previous point. As a writer, I involved myself in distribution. So I wanted to, I suppose South Africa is so much a smaller country. But in the US, as I involved myself in distribution by actually, pinpointing certain bookstores that I know I'd like to target, and I approached my publisher and said, can you please make these books available at these bookstores? So, it doesn't stop with writing, editing, publishing. I think a writer can become involved in distribution as well, because I know in certain areas in the US, I know a lot of people. So I felt if I make my books available there, then it assists the publisher a little, because it gives them an idea, like a roadmap as to where this book should be made available. But your question was Yeah, I mean, look, I'm not I didn't go and I didn't get a degree in writing. My degree is in the medical profession. And somewhere in the middle of that, I decided that I want to learn writing. And I did a course, a certificate course in writing. But yes, I think very much, I think these courses do help in craft of writing. I learned so much from these courses, from going to writing college, and then now still building on that. The reason I say I learned from that is because I know myself as a writer. I'm not a planner. I'm not very good at putting things together. I just write very wildly. And so the courses did not help me with the actual content, but it helped me to structure my, structure the structure of the novel. The other thing that the courses assisted me with was being able to understand and appreciate other people's literature. And in that way, I was able to take on board many different types of genres and learn about what other people are writing. So my craft is actually fine-tuned in that way. Yeah.
Well, that's you have made some very interesting points about writing colleges, writing schools. But Manasi, what do you feel as an editor about writing schools? Do you find that the work that you get from writers who have formally studied the craft of writing is better than those who just write?
We often joke, and I'm sure you've made this joke yourself, that, oh, this is an MFA manuscript, because it's got a kind of, sometimes books that come out of writing schools have a kind of precision, and it's almost as though it's been crafted in a certain way with a great deal of forethought, and one can always tell that this is the writer that's been through writing school because of how precise and perfect the sentence construction is, and a lot of effort has gone into it. That it lacks the rawness that an unsolicited manuscript or a non-MFA manuscript will have. Having said that, I've published some terrific MFA writers, and I think one of the extraordinary things that an MFA or a writing program does is that it gives you those 2 or 3 years to do nothing but write, and that's a luxury. I mean, for those of us who have writers who have full-time jobs, or writers who are doing other things with their time, they rush home and write in the evenings and late into the nights, which explains the 3 a.m. phone calls. But that the luxury of spending that time doing nothing but writing and seeking feedback on your writing and perfecting your writing. At the end of the day, writing is nothing but rewriting. And so that's what I think a writing school gives you the time and the space and the luxury of doing.
Well, I mean, I didn't do an MFA, and I considered it at some point, just for the space, and also to be able to say to people, I'm a writer. So, you feel more credible. But yes, I was writing in between jobs, in between babies, in the middle of the night, in the middle of cooking, I was writing. And so I never had that luxury of just being a writer. But in a way, I felt that added to my writing. I felt that chaos that I'm living in, and the not having that structured start writing at 8 a.m. and stop writing at 11 a.m., that made my writing better, because I would write based on my emotions and what I was feeling, and if I just didn't feel like writing, I wouldn't. With an MFA, you're almost compelled to write all the time, and then what you bring out is almost it's sometimes a bit static, it's not very dynamic. So I did the writing course, which is just a certificate, and that was just purely for me to familiarize myself with the process.
But writing is such a lonely process as well, that I think having a degree, having a set of classmates, having a peer group that's reviewing what you're writing, it takes away the loneliness, I think. A lot of writers have said this to me.
Oh, it's ultimately lonely. I was saying to Renuka in the car when we were driving over here, my father is a writer, and he always told me, please don't become a writer. And it's a very lonely life. But the one thing I miss is that community of writers. When you're in an MFA, you have that. And I think one of the ways to get past that is writer residencies.
Right.
Yeah.
Of course.
And I've been on a few writer residencies where you have that burst of being part of a group of writers, and then you have your time to go away, be alone, and actually get the job done. Yeah.
What about you, Renuka? What do you feel about products of writing schools?
Well, as you said, I have read and published some very good manuscripts, which where the author has been to a writing school, and it's definitely helped their writing. But I've also, I think one of the problems with a writing school is that it makes the author too conscious of the craft of writing, rather than just speaking from their heart, writing from their heart, and not being so aware of exactly how each sentence is constructed, or using a particular kind of phrase because it sounds good and so on. And I think the good writers are the ones who overcome this, who can draw the benefits of a writing school, the kind of discipline that it teaches you, and the kind of maybe consciousness that it creates about the importance of language and expression, but still use that. I mean, don't let it destroy your own inner talents. You know, use what you've learned, but still speak and write from the heart. That's what I feel. And I have also dealt with authors who the first manuscript they've sent me, which may have been a flawed manuscript, but because it was just written by them the way they wanted to write it, however flawed the work, however much editing or restructuring it may have needed, it had a kind of genuineness where after the first novel, the author then went to a writing school. The second one sort of lacked that kind of exuberance, or the sort of authenticity which the first one had. So, there's good and there's bad in writing schools.
Do you think that writers make good editors, or that editors make good writers?
I definitely don't think editors make good writers, not always. And whether writers make good editors, well, I don't think so either. Because the few works that I have read which have been edited by a writer, a writer gets too involved in the whole writerly process, looks at it too much from the writer's point of view. What I'm trying to say, doesn't have the objectivity of an editor. I won't mention names, but there is a very well-known author and publisher his first work was edited by one of his own authors. I'm sure you know who I'm talking about, but I won't mention names. And when I read that book, I said, God, it could have really done with a lot of editing, because there were so many completely extraneous passages, which as an editor, I would have just said, take them out. But as since the person who was editing it was himself a writer, he was probably more sympathetic. But realistically, yes, certainly an editor can make a good writer. There are many people in the publishing world who've gone on to write their own books and have done well. So I think there it's a question of talent. You can be a good editor, you can also be a good writer.
I've been asked by writers that I know to help them edit their manuscripts, and I've always turned it down because I don't think I'll do a good job, and that's the honest truth. I think I'll be doing a disservice to that writer. I mean, I can take on the project, but it's just not something I feel I can do without trying to always inject my writing style into this person's work. And so as a writer, one of the things you always consider is, should I become an editor at some point? And I think with editors, they're always thinking, should I become a writer? Should I write a book? But I think each one has their own particular role to play in producing the finished product. As a writer, I've never taken on any editing work. Yeah.
So I'm keen to know, when you are actually giving edits to an author, and sometimes we say harsh things. We say this doesn't work, this makes no sense. Take this entire chapter out. We've said things like that. What is your bedside manner like when you deliver these harsh truths upon authors?
It varies, and I've learned to be more tactful than I used to be in the beginning. But, if it's an author whom I'm very comfortable with, familiar with, and so on, then I'm pretty upfront and, honest about the way I put things. I've actually said, marked passages for authors saying this is rubbish or it makes no sense, or things like that, and they take it. But then you have to know the author you're dealing with. You need to know them well enough to know how blunt you can be. Certainly there are other authors where I know that kind of language would just make them fly off the bows and it wouldn't work at all. So there I have to put things much more carefully, saying this would sound better if it was put this way, or, if it's a passage which I feel is completely going off at a tangent, just say, here you're losing the reader here, it's taking away from the main story, things like that. And then there are writers where I find that they're very good at taking suggestions, but they don't want you to actually change their language yourself. So, one has to basically, I think once you start working with an author, it's like the psychology also comes in. You have to figure out the temperament of the author and sort of deal with them accordingly.
One of my favorite stories is when apparently John Green delivered the manuscript of the book he wrote after The Fault in Our Stars. His editor sent a one-line feedback email to him which said, "This reads like a bad imitation of a John Green novel." And I thought that was fantastic.
That's great. Well, I think we have a few minutes for questions, if anyone has questions.
Prahlad Singh Shekhawat from Jaipur. I'm a writer and freelance journalist. It could be for all of you, especially the editors. When you look at a work, what is the criteria? What are the standards you use to distinguish what is good work, what is good literature, what is written well, structured well, and so on? What are the criteria? And secondly, as you said, in India, there are very few literary agencies. So who are some of them which you think a writer should approach? And where can I find them? Thank you.
Well, I think as far as the agents go, it wouldn't be appropriate to name them at this stage. This is not the forum. But as far as what makes a good work and what doesn't make a good work, I think, first of all, when an author, before you submit your work to an author, all publishers do have websites. So my first advice would be, please go to the author's website, to the publisher's website, and see what kind of books they do. Because we do get a lot of manuscripts which just don't, which are about subjects which we just don't publish, or the kind of books which we just don't publish. Like, for instance, at Speaking Tiger, we're at the moment not doing illustrated books or coffee table books at all. We don't do regular cookbooks as in just recipes. We do more like food and stories combined, that kind of thing. And we do very little commercial or mass market fiction. Our fiction is more on the literary side. So there are a lot of manuscripts which one just rejects straight away, not because they're good or bad, but because they simply don't fit our publishing program. So if you don't want to waste your time and the publisher's time, first familiarize yourself with what each publisher is publishing, and then send your manuscript. And then within that, of course, writing is very important, of course. So we do look at how well a manuscript is written in terms of just sheer language and and grammar and expression and so on. But I think more important than that is there has to be a strong story, a strong substance. Because I think as editors, we are all prepared to work with the author on improving the quality of the language and the writing and the structure and so on. That's our job as editors. But there has to be a content. You can't make a cake without the ingredients. So in the same way, you can't make a good book unless the basic ingredients are there. So I think that's another thing. There has to be a good enough story, a strong enough content for an editor to work with. And beyond that, it also depends again on whether it is something which would be of interest to readers in the present times. These are the 2 or 3 things that I can think of. Manasi, how about you?
I think I agree with everything you've said, but I'd just like to add that we are, as editors, we're like gatekeepers, we're curators, and I think it would be very hard for me to give you a set of criteria that I follow while making a decision on a manuscript. Because much as we try to make this a data-driven industry, it is simply not. There is simply no way for me to predict that next year there will be a lot of books about mythology and they will sell. There is simply no way for me to predict what changing tastes are going to be like. And the only thing I can tell you is that if I instinctively fall in love with a book, then nothing can stop me from publishing it. It's gut, instinct, experience. It's a combination of all of those things. But if I ever approached it by thinking that these are the criteria that this book fits into and there's this one criterion it does not fit into, I fear that I would be approaching my job in a mechanical way, and that's where the problem begins.
Yeah, I totally agree with you about the gut feeling. But also, I remember some years ago I was talking to an editor from Orion Publishers in the UK, and she was a commissioning editor like myself. So I asked her, how many submissions do you read? And she said, about 10. So I thought she meant 10 in a month, and she said she meant 10 in a day. So I said, God, how do you read so many in one day? So she said, I have a rule of thumb. Of course, there are some manuscripts which are clearly bad. You can tell that in the first 10 pages, sometimes on the first page itself. And this is where the pitch or the synopsis is important, because sometimes you can tell it even from the way the synopsis is written. If it's badly written, it's not going to be good. But she said the rule of thumb she follows is she reads the first 50 pages, and if that is interesting enough, she'll read the next 50. But she said if a book is not good enough to really grab you in the first 100 pages, it's really, you can be pretty sure it's not going to grab you in the next 100 pages. So that's where she stops. And that's how she's able to get through so many submissions so quickly. So that's very difficult to define, because every story is its own story. You need to have a good story, a good enough content, whatever you're writing about, whether it's fiction, whether it's non-fiction, whether it's a biography or an autobiography. Yeah. So hold your interest, yeah.
My question is to both the editors. Have you ever regretted as such editing a certain this thing out of an author's context? Like all the books you published, have you ever felt that this could have been, in this better way?
Look, I think that the process never ends for me. Sometimes I will read a manuscript, a book that I've edited, and look at it and think, maybe I could have done this differently. But there is no point at which I will stop thinking that, because for me, like for an author, the process never ever ends. There's always room to change a few things and make it a little bit different. Not necessarily better, but a little bit different. And I think I would never ever find myself at a point where I'm 100% satisfied with a book and be able to say, it's done, it's perfect, I can't touch this.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, I agree. I think unless it's really a very, very good author whose work is good to begin with, and then you just sort of add the finishing touches, or you just give it that little 5% more, it's very difficult to find the perfect book which, once it's published, you read it and feel that, okay, this is great as it stands. Usually if I read any of the books that I've edited after they've been published, I do, apart from typos, which no matter how you try, do tend to creep in, but I do generally feel that, I wish we'd changed this, or this could have been worked on a little more. But then there has to be a cut-off point. If in the end the book is going to be published, then you have to stop at some point and just hopefully bring it up to the point where it's as good as it can be.
Good afternoon, I'm Prakash. I'm a freelance writer. So one thing which I have often noticed is that even in this age, when the attention span is supposed to be very short, many of the books, especially fiction, some of them are extremely verbose. And very often I have wondered why an editor has not done what is necessary. Because many writers, I'm not giving any names, many writers, Indian as well as overseas writers, they have a slight tendency to show off and the knowledge, the show of the knowledge they have in some particular subject. So some extra descriptive passages are seen in some of the books. The books are basically good. So I have wondered whether the editors have applied their mind. That is one thing. Second thing is whether the editors have concurred with the auditor, with the writer in deciding that these parts are essential for the book.
Well, I think they're lazy editors and they're difficult authors. So sometimes it is a fact that if the book is basically good, the editor doesn't really spend too much time over it and lets it go more or less as it is. There is a corollary to that, especially in today's day and age where it's such a competitive marketplace. We are all, I think, under tremendous pressure to publish a lot of books. So, every editor is dealing with at least 2 or 3 books at various stages at any given time. So, if a book seems to be reasonably good enough, whereas another book needs definitely more work, then you are inclined to be a little not spend as much time as you should have. And as you say, a lot of books come out much too verbose and where you feel that why didn't the editor apply their mind? The editor probably didn't have time. But the other part is difficult authors. I mean, there are authors who absolutely just refuse to let you change or to cut out bits of their work. And since if you're going to publish the book, the author does have the final say. It's a question of the author either then walking away, taking their book back and walking away, or then you compromise and you say, okay, let it go as it is. And the publisher, the author has the final say in that. How about you, Manasi?
I agree completely, absolutely with everything you've said.
Maybe that applies more to the veteran writers or the celebrities.
No, on the contrary, I find the really veteran authors and the really well-known authors to deal with are much more open to editing than first-time authors or authors who are not so well established. I find that time and again. But as I said, when you're dealing with a veteran author who's published many, many books and has reached a certain stature, then you have to, there it's more a question of suggestion rather than just taking your pen and rewriting or changing something. But the better authors are always open to good editorial suggestions. In fact, they welcome it, but your suggestions have to make sense. They're equally critical and sarcastic about suggestions which are really irrelevant or which don't make sense.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, I'm Catriona from Australia. To go back to the question of agents in India, from what I can tell, it seems that in the West, the agent is a much more entrenched part of the publishing journey than in India. Correct me if I'm wrong. But I'm just wondering if you see agents taking up a much more major role in India going forwards. For instance, in the West, many, many publishing houses don't take any manuscripts unless they're from an agent.
whereas here the publishers seem to be more open to unsolicited manuscripts. And also, as a second part of that, I just wonder, for those authors being published for the first time in India, would they have a better chance with an agent to then take the book to other territories?
I certainly see it happening in the next decade or so, that the agent is going to become a more important cog in the wheel. You know, I think it's certainly going to happen. In my time in publishing, which hasn't been very long, I have certainly seen the increasing importance in the role of the agent, and I think it's bound to grow. Because in India, which is now the second largest English language publishing market in the world, and potentially the largest in all across languages, I think that what is going to happen is the abundance of manuscripts that make its way to a publishing house is just going to cause a kind of exhaustion that is going to automatically make it necessary for an intermediary to step in. Having said that, I also do think that there's some magic in being able to walk up to... I'm not just talking about unsolicited manuscripts. Very often what I do, and I'm sure Renuka does the same thing, I meet somebody and I think their story is fascinating, or the work that they do is fascinating. And I think to myself, there's a book in this person, and this person may not have thought of it. And that's, I think, the difference between acquiring a book and commissioning a book. And commissioning a book is a kind of joy that I don't think acquisition has. There's a kind of joy in being able to watch something grow from the very beginning. And I don't want that to be taken out of the process at all. So I think maybe that's where the agent will not play an important role. With regard to territories, internationally, yes. I know that especially in the US and the UK, publishing houses, particularly the large ones, do not read unsolicited manuscripts, but they will read from publishers. So if I, at Penguin Random House India, want to send something to a colleague in the UK or the US, they are very likely to take a look at it, simply because it's coming from within the system. And if the writer is willing to sign away world rights to me as a publisher, then I have every right to write to any publisher in the world and say, I'm about to publish this book in India. Would you like to take a look at it? And maybe we can publish this together. And in my previous job, I was managing rights at HarperCollins for several years. And I have had terrific successes simply because I'm going at it from within the system than from outside.
So since we have just about 2 minutes left, shall we give the last word to the writer in our midst? Priya, what would be your advice to editors?
To editors, my advice to editors. Yes. Oh, I think it works the other way around. The editors are giving me advice all the time. So this is my chance to give them advice. I think one of the biggest pieces of advice I'd like to give to somebody editing my work is that they need to get to know me and get to know where I'm coming from. So this is not just a blind piece of black and white ink on paper. It's coming from a person and it's coming from a place. So, an editor, you just meet them online probably, and you probably never meet them in person ever again. And so the relationship between an editor and a writer needs to be nurtured as much as the book needs to be nurtured. I think that I would leave as my last words.
Well, thank you, and thank you, Manasi. Thank you all.
We have come to the end of the session. Thank you for your insightful talk. And as a token of our love, we would like to present a memento. And I request Renu Abraham, sir, to give away the mementos.